There's nothing quite like watching everyone you once mattered to slowly turn away from you. Margaret had learned this truth at 76, sitting alone at her granddaughter's wedding while empty chairs surrounded her like silent accusations. The men who once filled those seats had found reasons to sit elsewhere, her late husband's brothers, old friends, former admirers who now seemed embarrassed by her silver hair and the lines time had carved into her face. She had become invisible in plain sight, a ghost among the living. But when the chapel doors burst open and a familiar figure stepped inside, everything changed. He looked exactly as she remembered from 50 years ago, tall, commanding, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. Lancelot had returned, the vampire she had once nursed back to health, who had offered her immortality in exchange for her kindness. She had chosen mortality then, chosen a human life of love and loss. Now, as whispers rippled through the wedding guests, he walked straight toward her table. What could bring an immortal back to a woman the world had already forgotten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Eleanor Whitmore had not always been invisible. Once, her laughter had filled rooms, her presence had commanded attention, and her opinions had mattered to the people she loved. That woman felt like a stranger now, buried beneath decades of widowhood and the gradual, inexorable process of being forgotten. The wedding ring on her finger caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows of Blackthorn Manor. She twisted it absently, a habit born of 53 years of marriage to Thomas Whitmore, a good man who had loved her fiercely until cancer claimed him 7 years ago. The ring had grown loose on her finger, like everything else in her life, relationships that no longer fit quite right, a house too big for one person, a role in her family that seemed to diminish with each passing year. Emma looked radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, the same ivory silk that Margaret had worn in 1971 when she married Thomas in this very chapel. The dress had required extensive alterations to fit Emma's taller, more slender frame, but seeing it worn again brought Margaret a bittersweet joy. At least something of hers still mattered, still held value. "Grandma Maggie, you look beautiful." Emma had said that morning while getting ready, but Margaret caught the worried glance her granddaughter shared with her mother. They all worried about her now, about her living alone in the old Victorian house, about her driving at night, about her stubbornness in refusing to consider assisted living. They meant well, but their concern felt suffocating. A constant reminder that she was no longer seen as capable, no longer trusted to make her own decisions. The manor itself seemed to echo with memories. Built in 1847 by Emma's new husband's great-great-grandfather, Blackthorn Manor had been the setting for countless family celebrations over the generations. Margaret remembered attending weddings here as a young woman, dancing until dawn, laughing with friends who were now mostly dead or confined to nursing homes. The Gothic architecture that had once seemed romantic and mysterious now felt oppressive, its dark stone walls and towering arches creating shadows that seemed to swallow light. Her son David sat 3 tables away with his wife Patricia and their teenage children. He glanced over occasionally, that same worried expression Emma had worn earlier. David meant well, but he had inherited his father's protective streak without Thomas's gentle touch. Every conversation these days seemed to include suggestions about Margaret's future plans, thinly veiled attempts to convince her to give up her independence. "Mom, we just think it might be time to consider downsizing," he had said last month. "The house is so big, and if something happened, I would handle it." Margaret had replied, perhaps more sharply than necessary. "I've been handling things for 76 years, David. I think I can manage a while longer." But could she? Lately, Margaret found herself wondering if they were right to worry. The house did feel enormous when she rattled around in it alone. Simple tasks like changing light bulbs or reaching items on high shelves had become challenges. Her arthritis made opening jars difficult, and she had started buying smaller containers of everything to avoid the struggle. These small defeats accumulated like drops of water, wearing away stone. The wedding guests chatted around her, their conversations washing over her like background noise. She recognized most of the faces, neighbors, family, friends, people who had known her for decades. Yet somehow she felt like an outsider, looking in on a world she no longer quite belonged to. When had she become the elderly relative people felt obligated to include, but didn't quite know how to engage with? Margaret's mind drifted to her own wedding day 53 years ago. She had been 23, radiant with happiness and certainty about her future. Thomas had been 25, fresh out of law school and ready to take on the world. They had danced to "The Way You Look Tonight," and she had felt beautiful, desired, and utterly secure in the knowledge that she was loved. Those early years of marriage had been magical. Thomas's law practice grew steadily, and Margaret threw herself into being a wife and mother. David arrived 2 years after their wedding, followed by Sarah 3 years later, and then Michael 2 years after that. The house had been full of noise and laughter, scraped knees and bedtime stories, homework battles and family dinners around the big oak table. Margaret had been active in the community then. She served on the school board, organized charity drives, hosted dinner parties that brought together the most interesting people in town. She had opinions about everything: politics, education, social issues, and people listened when she spoke. She had been somebody. But widowhood had changed everything. The dinner invitations stopped coming. Her opinions, once valued, now seemed to irritate people who saw them as the stubborn ramblings of an old woman set in her ways. The volunteer work that had once fulfilled her became difficult to maintain as transportation became a problem and her energy flagged. The worst part was how invisible she had become to men. Not that she was looking for romance. Thomas had been the love of her life, and she had no desire to replace him, but the complete absence of male attention still stung. Men her age either had wives who watched them like hawks or were looking for much younger companions to make them feel vital again. She had become part of the furniture, unremarkable and easily overlooked. The empty chairs around her table told that story perfectly. When the wedding invitations went out, she had been seated with Thomas's brothers, old family friends, and a few of her contemporary couples. But Thomas's brothers had found excuses not to attend. One was feeling under the weather, another had prior commitments. The family friends had similar last-minute cancellations. The couples who did come had been seated elsewhere, leaving Margaret alone at what was essentially a table for one. She understood, even if it hurt. She was a reminder of mortality, of what lay ahead for all of them. Her silver hair and lined face were previews of their own futures, and nobody wanted to spend a joyful occasion contemplating aging and death. Better to seat her alone than to have her presence dampen the mood at other tables. Emma's new husband, James, was a good man. Margaret could see the way he looked at her granddaughter, the same expression of wonder and devotion that Thomas had once worn when looking at her. James came from old money, the Blackthorn fortune built on shipping and real estate investments that had survived multiple economic downturns. The wedding was lavish by any standard, with flowers flown in from Holland and a string quartet playing classical pieces that echoed beautifully through the stone chapel. Margaret smoothed the navy blue dress she had chosen for the occasion. It was one of her favorites, purchased during a shopping trip with Sarah last year. The color brought out her eyes, which were still her best feature, and the cut was flattering without trying to look younger than her years. She had learned long ago that there was nothing more pathetic than an old woman desperately trying to recapture her youth. The ceremony had been beautiful. Emma's vows had been heartfelt, speaking of partnership and growth and facing life's challenges together. Margaret had cried the proud tears of a grandmother, watching her granddaughter embark on the same journey she had taken so many years ago. But the tears had also been tinged with sadness, a mourning for everything she had lost. During the reception, Margaret had tried to mingle, but conversations felt forced and brief. People asked about her health with the kind of polite concern reserved for elderly relatives, then quickly moved on to more interesting topics. She found herself retreating to quiet corners, watching the festivities from the sidelines. The young people danced with abandon, lost in the music and each other. The middle-aged guests formed clusters around the bar, catching up on career achievements and children's accomplishments. But where did that leave her? What role was there for someone who had already lived their life, whose best years were behind them? Margaret thought about the woman she had been at 26. That woman had been fearless, passionate, and absolutely certain about what she wanted from life. She had made choices that seemed impossible now, had turned down opportunities that her elderly self could barely comprehend. There had been roads not taken, paths abandoned for the safety and security of conventional life. The strangest thing was how clearly she could remember being young. The memories were so vivid, she could still feel the quickening of her pulse when Thomas first kissed her, could still recall the exact shade of lipstick she wore to their first date. But that young woman felt like someone else entirely, someone she had lost touch with so gradually that she hadn't noticed the transformation until it was complete. Now, as the afternoon shadows lengthened through the stained glass windows, Margaret felt the weight of every one of her 76 years. Her feet ached in the low heels she had chosen for the occasion. Her back protested from sitting too long in the uncomfortable wooden chairs. Even the simple act of standing required careful consideration to avoid the dizziness that sometimes plagued her. The manor's ancient stones seemed to absorb sound, creating pockets of eerie silence despite the crowd. Margaret noticed how the temperature seemed to fluctuate, warm in the sunny spots near the windows, surprisingly cool in the shadowed corners. The Gothic architecture that had once charmed her now felt oppressive, all pointed arches and gargoyles leering down from the high ceiling. But it was in one of those cool, shadowed corners that Margaret first felt a change in the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. The air seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. Other guests appeared oblivious, continuing their conversations and laughter, but Margaret felt something approaching, something that made her heart race with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Was it fear? Or something else entirely, the recognition of a presence she had thought never to encounter again? Margaret's hand tightened on her purse, where she kept her most precious secrets, including one that no living person knew. A pressed rose, dried and fragile, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. A memento from a time when she had been someone else entirely, when impossible choices had seemed possible and the world had been full of magic she had chosen to leave behind. The feeling grew stronger, pulling her attention toward the chapel's heavy oak doors. Something was coming, something that would change everything. Margaret straightened in her chair, her pulse quickening with a mixture of anticipation and terror. After 50 years of ordinary life, the extraordinary was about to return. The chapel doors didn't merely open, they burst inward with a force that sent cold air sweeping through the warm hall like winter given form. Every candle flame flickered in unison, and the string quartet's delicate melody faltered as musicians looked up in confusion. Conversations died mid-sentence as 200 guests turned toward the entrance, their collective intake of breath creating an eerie whistle through the stone arches. He stood framed in the doorway like a figure from a Gothic painting, tall and imposing against the darkening sky beyond. The late afternoon light behind him cast his face in shadow, but Margaret knew those shoulders, that bearing, the way he held his head with quiet authority. Even after 50 years, she would recognize him anywhere. Lancelot. The name whispered through her mind like a prayer or a curse. He looked exactly as she remembered, not a day older than the 35 years he had appeared to be when she first met him in 1974. His dark hair showed no trace of silver, his face bore no lines of age, and when he stepped into the chapel proper, moving with that same fluid grace she remembered, Margaret's heart began to race with an emotion she couldn't name. Around his neck hung a medallion she recognized, an intricate piece of silver work that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. She had watched him touch it during their conversations all those years ago, a nervous habit that made him seem more human than the immortal creature he claimed to be. "Excuse me." James's father stood from the head table, his voice carrying the authority of old money and social position. "I'm afraid this is a private ceremony." Lancelot's gaze swept across the assembled guests with practiced ease, but when his eyes found Margaret's, the world seemed to still. Those eyes, dark as midnight but somehow luminous, held recognition, tenderness, and something that might have been relief. He had been looking for her. "I've come to pay my respects," Lancelot said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel despite its quiet tone. There was an accent there, something old world that spoke of centuries rather than decades. "To honor someone very dear to me." Margaret felt the weight of 200 stares as guests followed Lancelot's gaze to her solitary table. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment and something else, a flutter of the woman she had once been, the one who had mattered enough for an immortal to cross decades to find. The memory hit her with startling clarity, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday rather than 50 years ago. She had been 26, married to Thomas for only 3 years, working as a volunteer at St. Mary's Hospital. It was 1974, and she had drawn the night shift in the emergency wing, a duty most of the other volunteers avoided. She preferred the quiet hours, the chance to read between patients, the feeling that she was truly helping rather than just filling time. He had been brought in just after midnight, unconscious and covered in blood. No identification, no one to claim him, and injuries that should have been fatal. The doctors worked on him for hours, but privately told Margaret they didn't expect him to survive. She had been assigned to monitor him through the night, to provide whatever comfort she could in what they assumed would be his final hours. But he hadn't died. As dawn approached, his wounds began to heal at an impossible rate. When he finally opened his eyes, they had been that same midnight dark, filled with ancient knowledge and infinite sadness. "You stayed," he had said, his voice weak but strangely formal. "Someone should be here," Margaret had replied. "No one should die alone." "I'm not dying," he had said, and something in his tone made her believe him, despite all medical evidence to the contrary. "But thank you for thinking I was worth saving." Over the next 3 nights, while the medical staff marveled at his miraculous recovery, Margaret had sat with him during her volunteer shifts. He had told her impossible stories, of centuries lived, of wars witnessed, of loves lost to time. She should have thought him delusional, but there was something in his manner, in the way he spoke of historical events, as if he had witnessed them personally, that made her listen. On the 4th night, when he was well enough to leave but chose to stay, he had made his offer. "I could give you forever, Margaret," he had said, her name sounding like music in his ancient voice. "You have a rare soul, one that sees beauty in darkness, that offers comfort without expecting reward. You could live eternally, see the world change, never know the grief of aging or death." "What would I become?" she had asked, though part of her already knew. "What I am, a creature caught between worlds, sustained by blood but not ruled by bloodlust, lonely but with the capacity for love that transcends mortal understanding." Margaret had been tempted, more tempted than she had ever admitted to anyone, including herself. The offer had awakened something in her, a hunger for adventure and experience that her conventional life couldn't satisfy. But in the end, she had chosen differently. "I want to grow old," she had told him. "I want to have children and watch them grow. I want to love my husband completely, without reservation, without the shadow of immortality hanging over us. I want a human life, with all its pain and beauty." Lancelot had accepted her decision with grace, but not before leaving her with a single red rose and a promise. "If you ever need me, I will know." She had pressed that rose and kept it, though she could never explain why. Now, 50 years later, he stood in the chapel where her granddaughter was celebrating the beginning of her mortal love story, and Margaret understood why he had come. "Grandmother?" Emma's voice cut through the charged atmosphere. She had approached Margaret's table, wedding dress rustling against the stone floor. "Do you know this man?" Margaret looked up at her granddaughter, so young, so beautiful, so ready to begin the same journey Margaret had completed. How could she explain that once, long ago, she had been offered a different path entirely? "Yes," Margaret said quietly, "I know him." David appeared at Emma's shoulder, his protective instincts clearly activated. "Mom, if this man is bothering you—" "He's not bothering me," Margaret said, though her voice trembled slightly. She looked back at Lancelot, who had moved closer but maintained a respectful distance. "Are you Lancelot?" The use of his name sent a visible ripple through the nearby guests. It was an unusual name, one that carried weight and history. Several people murmured to their companions, trying to place where they might have heard it before. "Never," Lancelot replied, and Margaret heard in that single word the weight of 50 years of separation, of watching from afar, of respecting the choice she had made. "I came to see you again, if you would permit it." The medallion at his throat pulsed with soft silver light, and Margaret noticed that the temperature around them had dropped several degrees. Other guests were beginning to shift uncomfortably, sensing something beyond their understanding. "Perhaps we should take this conversation somewhere more private," James's mother suggested nervously. The reception can continue," Margaret said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. She stood slowly, her arthritic knees protesting, but managed to rise with dignity intact. As she moved toward him, Margaret was acutely aware of every eye in the chapel following her progress. She had become the center of attention in a way she hadn't experienced in decades, not because she was old and pitiful, but because she was part of something mysterious and important. When she reached Lancelot, he extended his hand, palm up, an invitation, not a demand. His skin was pale and cool, exactly as she remembered. The touch sent electricity through her aging body, awakening nerve endings that had been dormant for years. "You came," she whispered. "I promised I would know if you needed me," he replied. "And you do need me, don't you, Margaret?" She didn't know how to answer that question. What did she need? Companionship? Validation that her life had mattered? Or something else entirely? Something that had to do with the way he looked at her, not as an elderly woman to be pitied, but as the person she had always been underneath the accumulated years. "Yes," she admitted, "I think I do." Behind them, the wedding guests buzzed with speculation and concern, but Margaret found she no longer cared what they thought. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, truly known. Whatever came next, this moment of recognition was worth the disruption it had caused. The chapel erupted in a chaos of whispered conversations and concerned murmurs as Margaret took Lancelot's outstretched hand. His fingers were exactly as she remembered, cool, strong, and somehow comforting despite their supernatural chill. The touch awakened memories she had buried so deeply she had almost convinced herself they were dreams. "Margaret, what's going on?" David's voice carried the sharp edge of a son, trying to protect his mother from what he perceived as a threat. He moved closer, his wife Patricia close behind, both wearing expressions of barely controlled alarm. "It's all right, David," Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely certain it was. The pressed rose in her purse seemed to pulse with warmth against her hip, as if responding to Lancelot's presence. She had carried that flower for 50 years, never quite understanding why she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Emma stepped forward, her wedding dress trailing behind her like liquid moonlight. Unlike her father, she showed no fear, only curiosity, and something that might have been excitement. "Grandmother, how do you know this man?" Before Margaret could answer, James appeared at his bride's side, his protective instincts clearly activated. "Emma, perhaps you should step back." "I don't think that's necessary," Emma replied, studying Lancelot with the kind of direct gaze that reminded Margaret painfully of herself at that age. "Are you dangerous?" she asked him directly. Lancelot's lips curved in what might have been amusement. "Not to your grandmother, or to anyone she holds dear. I give you my word." The word of a stranger means very little, David interjected, moving to place himself between Lancelot and his family. Mum, I think we should call security. There's no security at a family wedding, David, Margaret said dryly. And he's not a stranger. Not to me. She looked up at Lancelot, seeing him clearly for the first time in 50 years. He was exactly as she remembered, but her perspective had changed entirely. Where once she had seen mystery and danger, now she saw something else, loneliness that matched her own. The other wedding guests had formed a loose circle around them, some curious, others clearly uncomfortable with the disruption to what should have been a joyful celebration. Margaret could hear fragments of conversation. Who is he? How does she know him? Should someone call the police? Perhaps, Lancelot said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low tone. We might continue this conversation somewhere more private. Margaret felt the weight of 200 stares and realized he was right. Whatever was happening between them, it didn't need to be a public spectacle. She looked around the chapel, noting how the shadows seemed deeper where Lancelot stood, how the temperature continued to drop despite the afternoon warmth outside. The library, she said finally. Blackthorn Manor has a beautiful library. We could speak there. James nodded reluctantly. Of course. It's just down the hall from here. As they began to move toward the chapel doors, Margaret became aware of Lancelot's effect on the environment around him. Candle flames leaned away from him as he passed, not flickering but bending as if blown by an unfelt wind. The shadows cast by the Gothic pillars seemed to reach toward him, and she noticed that several guests shivered involuntarily when he drew near, though none of them appeared to understand why. Margaret, Patricia caught her arm gently. Are you sure about this? We don't know anything about this man. I know enough, Margaret replied, though even as she said it, she wondered if that was true. She knew what Lancelot had told her 50 years ago, but how much of that had been real, and how much the product of an old woman's romantic imagination. The memories seemed so vivid, but memory could play tricks. The pressed rose in her purse grew warmer. As they walked through the manor's corridors, Margaret became increasingly aware of how Lancelot moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His footsteps made no sound on the ancient stone floors, and when they passed mirrors in the hallway, she noticed with a start that his reflection was fainter than it should have been, as if he existed only partially in the physical world. The library was exactly as Margaret remembered it from previous visits, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, anchored by an enormous fireplace and furnished with deep leather chairs that had been arranged for intimate conversation. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the Persian rugs. Emma had insisted on accompanying them despite her father's protests. It's my wedding day, she had said, with the kind of determination that reminded Margaret of herself. If something extraordinary is happening, I want to witness it. David had reluctantly agreed to give them space, but positioned himself just outside the library doors, where he could intervene if necessary. Margaret appreciated his concern, even if she found it suffocating. Once they were alone, or as alone as they could be with Emma present, Lancelot moved to one of the tall windows and stood silhouetted against the light. From this angle, Margaret could see him clearly, and the sight took her breath away. He truly hadn't aged a single day. While she had accumulated wrinkles and silver hair, had watched her body betray her in countless small ways, he remained frozen in time. "You're really him," she whispered. "All these years I wondered if I had imagined you. You didn't imagine me, Margaret." His voice carried the same formal cadence she remembered, as if English were a language he had learned long ago, but never quite made his native tongue. "Just as I never forgot you." Emma settled into one of the leather chairs, her wedding dress arranged carefully around her. "Grandmother, will you please explain what's happening?" Margaret reached into her purse with trembling fingers and withdrew the small tissue-wrapped package she had carried for 50 years. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing the pressed rose still perfectly preserved, its deep red color unchanged despite the passage of time. 50 years ago, Margaret began slowly, I worked as a volunteer at St. Mary's Hospital. One night, a man was brought in with injuries that should have been fatal. He recovered in ways that medical science couldn't explain. That's impossible, Emma said, but her tone suggested she wanted to believe rather than dismiss. Many things are impossible until they happen, Lancelot said quietly. He turned from the window, and Margaret saw that his eyes held the same ancient sadness she remembered. I was grateful for your grandmother's kindness. She sat with me when others feared to approach, spoke to me when doctors had given up hope. What are you? Emma asked with startling directness. Lancelot smiled, and for a moment Margaret glimpsed the man she had known, not the supernatural creature of legend, but someone who had been alone for far too long and had found unexpected comfort in human connection. I am exactly what your grandmother remembers me to be, he said. Nothing more, nothing less. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. She had made her choice 50 years ago, had chosen mortality and human love over the unknown possibilities he offered. She had lived a good life, had been a devoted wife, loving mother, caring grandmother, but sitting here now, seeing him unchanged while she bore the weight of every year that had passed, she felt the ghost of the woman she might have become. "Why have you come back?" she asked. "Because," Lancelot said simply, "I made you a promise." The library's atmosphere seemed to shift as Lancelot moved away from the window, settling into the chair across from Margaret with movements that were almost too fluid to be human. Emma watched with fascination, but Margaret found herself studying the leather-bound journal he withdrew from an inner pocket of his dark coat, a journal that looked as old as time itself. "You kept a record," Margaret observed, recognizing the worn leather and tarnished clasps that held it closed. "I keep records of many things," Lancelot replied, his fingers tracing the journal's cover with something approaching reverence. "But this particular volume is devoted entirely to you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that Margaret wasn't certain she was ready to explore. Emma leaned forward in her chair, wedding dress rustling with her movement. "You've been watching my grandmother for 50 years. There was no accusation in Emma's voice, only a kind of awed wonder that reminded Margaret painfully of herself at that age. "Watching over," Lancelot corrected gently. "There's a difference. I have never intruded upon your grandmother's life, never interfered with her choices. But I have observed." From a distance, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold that seemed to follow Lancelot wherever he went. "What do you mean, observed?" Instead of answering immediately, Lancelot opened the journal. The pages were filled with careful handwriting in what appeared to be several different languages, some of which used scripts Margaret didn't recognize. But as he turned to a section near the middle, she caught glimpses of English text and what looked like pressed flowers, similar to her own rose. "June 15th, 1975, Lancelot read aloud, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a treasured memory. "Margaret gave birth to her daughter today. I watched from the hospital parking lot as Thomas paced the waiting room, saw his face when the doctor announced that both mother and child were healthy. The joy in that man's eyes reminded me why Margaret chose mortality, the depth of human emotion, the way love multiplies rather than diminishes when shared." Margaret's breath caught. Sarah's birth she remembered that day vividly, remembered Thomas's tears of relief and happiness. But knowing that Lancelot had been there, had witnessed one of the most intimate moments of her life, left her feeling exposed in ways she couldn't articulate. "You were there," she whispered. "I was there for all of it," Lancelot said softly. "David's first day of school, September 8th, 1978. You wore a blue dress and cried in the parking lot after he disappeared into the building. Michael's graduation from college, May 12th, 2001. You sat in the third row, center section, and your pride was visible from across the auditorium. Emma's eyes were wide with amazement. "That's incredibly romantic," she breathed. But Margaret felt something closer to violation than romance. "You had no right," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Those were my moments, my life. You had no right to witness them without my knowledge." Lancelot closed the journal carefully, his expression one of genuine regret. "You're correct, of course. I had no right, but I had no choice either." "What do you mean?" "When you nursed me back to health 50 years ago, when you sat with me through those long nights and spoke to me as if I were human rather than monster, something changed in me. For the first time in centuries, I felt connected to someone, to something larger than my own existence." He stood and moved to the fireplace, his reflection barely visible in the polished brass of the fire tools. "I have lived for over 800 years, Margaret. I have seen empires rise and fall, have loved and lost more times than I care to remember. But what you offered me in that hospital room was something I had never experienced before. Compassion without expectation, kindness without agenda." Margaret felt her anger beginning to soften, replaced by something more complex. She understood loneliness, had felt it acutely since Thomas's death, but Lancelot's loneliness stretched across centuries, an isolation she could barely comprehend. "So you watched me live the life I chose, instead of the one you offered," she said slowly. "I watched you love completely," he replied. "Watched you pour yourself into your marriage, your children, your community. Watched you create beauty and meaning from the brief span of years you were given. And I learned from you." "Learned what?" Lancelot turned from the fireplace, and Margaret saw something in his expression that took her breath away, a depth of emotion that spoke of decades of careful observation and growing understanding. "I learned that immortality without connection is meaningless," he said. "That the value of a life isn't measured in years, but in the love it creates and sustains. You taught me that by choosing mortality, you chose something infinitely more precious than eternal existence." Emma had been silent through this exchange, but now she spoke up. "But if you learned all that by watching her, why come back now? Why reveal yourself after all these years?" The question hung in the air, and Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for the answer. She could feel the weight of Lancelot's gaze, could sense that whatever he said next would change everything. "Because," Lancelot said slowly, "I sense that your grandmother is approaching a crossroads. Not the same choice she faced 50 years ago, but something different. Something that requires support." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. She had been feeling it herself, a sense that something was changing, that her comfortable routine was being disrupted by forces she couldn't name. The increasing isolation, the growing distance from her family, the feeling that she was becoming invisible even to people who loved her. "What kind of crossroads?" Emma asked, echoing Margaret's own thoughts. "The kind that comes when someone who has lived fully and loved completely begins to question whether their life still has meaning," Lancelot replied. "The kind that requires the reminder that some connections transcend time, age, and even death itself." Margaret's hand found the pressed rose in her lap, its preserved petals warm against her palm. She thought about the empty chairs at her table, about David's worried glances and his suggestions about downsizing, about the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, about how her opinions were dismissed as the ramblings of an old woman. "You came back because you thought I needed reminding that I matter," she said. "I came back because I know you matter," Lancelot corrected. "The question is whether you still believe it yourself." The library fell into contemplative silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the wedding reception continuing in the chapel. Margaret found herself staring at her reflection in the ornate mirror that hung above the fireplace, a mirror that had witnessed generations of Blackthorn family conversations within these walls. But what she saw there made her breath catch. The woman looking back at her wasn't the elderly, invisible figure she had grown accustomed to seeing. Sitting here with Lancelot, engaged in conversation that mattered, that had weight and meaning, she looked alive in ways she had forgotten were possible. Her eyes held spark, her posture spoke of engagement rather than resignation. Even her silver hair seemed to catch the light differently. "That mirror," Lancelot said quietly, noticing her gaze, "is older than it appears. Venetian glass, crafted in 1687 by a master who understood that mirrors reflect more than mere physical appearance." Margaret studied her reflection more carefully and gasped. For just a moment she could swear she saw herself as she had been at 26, not younger in appearance, but with the same fire, the same sense of possibility that had once defined her. The same woman who had been brave enough to sit with a wounded stranger through the night, who had been offered immortality and been strong enough to choose her own path. "How is that possible?" Emma breathed, leaning forward to look into the mirror herself. "Some mirrors show us not what we are, but what we have always been beneath the surface," Lancelot replied. "Your grandmother has never stopped being the woman I met in that hospital room. She has simply forgotten to see herself clearly." The door to the library burst open, and David strode in with the determined air of a man who had reached the end of his patience. Behind him came Patricia, several other family members, and James, who looked uncomfortable but resigned to family drama, interrupting his wedding day. "Mum, this has gone on long enough," David announced, his protective instincts clearly in overdrive. "I don't know who this man is or what kind of game he's playing, but—" "The only game being played," Margaret said with surprising steel in her voice, "is the one where my family decides what's best for me, without bothering to ask my opinion." The sharpness of her tone seemed to catch David off guard. He paused mid-stride, confusion replacing determination on his face. "Mom, I'm just trying to protect you. This stranger shows up claiming to know you, disrupting Emma's wedding." "His name is Lancelot," Margaret said firmly, "and he's not a stranger. I've known him for 50 years. "That's impossible," Patricia interjected. "You would have mentioned him. We would have met him." Margaret felt something inside her crystallize, a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. "Would you have? When, exactly? During Sunday dinners, where you discuss my health and whether I should still be driving? During holiday visits where you spend most of your time checking your phones and waiting to leave? When would I have had the opportunity to share anything meaningful about my life?" The accusation hung in the air, and Margaret could see the truth of it registering on her family's faces. When had they stopped seeing her as a person with a rich inner life and started treating her as a problem to be managed? "That's not fair," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Margaret stood slowly, using the chair arm for support, but managing the movement with dignity. "When was the last time any of you asked me about my dreams, my regrets, my hopes for whatever time I have left? When did you last treat me like someone whose thoughts and feelings matter?" Emma moved to her grandmother's side, wedding dress rustling with urgency. "Grandmother, we do care about your thoughts and feelings." "You care about my safety," Margaret corrected gently. "You care about my health, about whether I'm eating properly and taking my medications. But when was the last time anyone asked me what I think about books or politics, or whether I ever wonder what my life might have been like if I had made different choices?" Lancelot had remained silent during this exchange, but Margaret could feel his presence like a steadying force. In the mirror, she caught his eye and saw understanding there, the recognition of someone who knew what it felt like to be reduced to what others perceived rather than what you actually were. "I am not," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "a fragile old woman who needs to be protected from her own decisions. I am a woman with 76 years of experience who has survived childbirth, raised 3 children, supported a husband through law school, buried parents and friends, and managed to maintain her independence despite everyone's assumption that she's too old to know her own mind. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and Margaret realized that Lancelot's emotional state was affecting the environment around him. Shadows seemed deeper, the light from the windows less warm, and several family members were unconsciously drawing their jackets closer around themselves. "What exactly are you suggesting?" David asked, though his tone had lost its authoritative edge. Margaret looked around the room at the faces of people she loved, people who loved her but had stopped seeing her as anything more than their aging mother and grandmother. Then she looked at Lancelot, who met her gaze with the same respect and recognition he had shown 50 years ago. "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that I would like to have a conversation with an old friend without being treated like I'm suffering from dementia. I'm suggesting that at 76 years old, I'm still capable of making my own decisions about who I spend time with." "But, Mom," David said weakly, "we don't know anything about him." "You don't know anything about him," Margaret corrected. "I know exactly who he is and what he's offered me. I knew 50 years ago, and I know now." Patricia stepped forward, her expression concerned but less confrontational than her husband's. "Margaret, what did he offer you?" Margaret felt the weight of the pressed rose in her hand, felt the warmth of memories that had sustained her through lonely nights and difficult days. She thought about the choice she had made at 26, about the life she had lived because of that choice, and about the woman she had been before age and invisibility had diminished her in everyone's eyes, including her own. "He offered me the chance to be seen," she said simply, "to be valued for who I am rather than pitied for what I've become. 50 years ago, I chose differently because I had other priorities. But those priorities have been fulfilled, and I'm tired of being treated like an afterthought in my own life." The mirror behind her seemed to pulse with silver light, and for a moment everyone in the room could see what Lancelot saw, not an elderly woman to be managed and protected, but a person of substance and worth whose story was far from over. The silver light from the mirror faded, but its effect lingered in the stunned silence that followed Margaret's declaration. Emma was the first to move, crossing to an antique writing desk near the window where she began searching through its drawers with the kind of purposeful determination that reminded everyone present exactly whose granddaughter she was. "Emma, what are you doing?" James asked, though his tone suggested he was becoming resigned to his wedding day, taking unexpected turns. "Looking for the family albums that Mrs. Blackthorne keeps in here," Emma replied, not pausing in her search. "James's grandmother has been documenting family events in this house for decades. If Grandmother Margaret has been here before with—" She paused, pulling out a leather-bound photo album. "Found it." Margaret felt her heart skip as Emma opened the album and began flipping through pages of photographs spanning several decades. She knew what her granddaughter was looking for, and part of her hoped desperately that the evidence wouldn't be found. But another part, the part that had been awakened by Lancelot's presence, wanted the truth revealed at last. "Here," Emma said triumphantly, holding up the album, 1974, the Blackthorn Summer Charity Gala. Margaret's breath caught as she saw the photograph Emma was pointing to. It was a group shot taken on the manor's terrace, showing dozens of elegantly dressed guests posed for the camera. But there, in the back row, stood a woman Margaret barely recognized as herself at 26, radiant in a sapphire blue gown, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style popular at the time. Beside her stood a man whose face was unmistakable despite the passage of 50 years, Lancelot, looking exactly as he did now. The photograph was like a physical blow to everyone in the room. David sank into the nearest chair, his face pale with shock. Patricia covered her mouth with her hands. Even James, who had no context for understanding what this meant, could sense the magnitude of what they were seeing. "That's impossible," David whispered. People don't stay the same age for 50 years. People don't, Margaret agreed quietly, moving to look at the photograph more closely. She remembered that night vividly. It had been one of her last public appearances before Thomas's practice became demanding enough that they stopped attending social functions. She had been 6 months married, still glowing with newlywed happiness, and she had danced with several men that evening, including Lancelot. "You attended the charity gala together?" Emma asked, her voice filled with wonder rather than accusation. "Not together," Margaret corrected. "We encountered each other there. It was 3 months after the hospital, after he recovered." She looked at Lancelot, who was studying the photograph with an expression of profound sadness. "You came to see how I was doing. I came to say goodbye," Lancelot said softly. "I had hoped that seeing you in your natural environment, happy with your husband, surrounded by the life you had chosen, would help me accept your decision and move on. But it didn't," Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. "No, it made everything worse. You were luminous that night, every bit as beautiful as I remembered, but more than that, you were alive in ways that I had forgotten were possible. When you danced with me, when you smiled." He trailed off, the weight of 50 years of regret heavy in his voice. Patricia found her voice. "Margaret, you never mentioned attending this gala. Thomas never said anything about it." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thomas was in court that week, preparing for a major case. He couldn't attend, so I went alone. I thought it would be safe." "Safe? From what?" David asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand that his mother had lived a far more complex life than he had ever imagined. "Safe from temptation," Margaret admitted. "I knew Lancelot might be there. The Blackthorns had been his hosts during his recovery. They had connections to the hospital board. I thought I could handle seeing him again, thought it would provide closure." Emma was still studying the photograph. "You look happy here, grandmother. Both of you do." And it was true. In the picture, despite the complicated emotions Margaret remembered feeling that night, both she and Lancelot looked genuinely joyful. There was something in their body language, in the way they stood close together despite the crowd around them, that spoke of deep connection. "We danced 3 times, Margaret said, the memory coming back with startling clarity. "The first dance was proper, appropriate. The second was dangerous. By the third, people were beginning to talk." "What kind of talk?" James asked, drawn into the story despite himself. "The kind that happens when a married woman dances with the same man too many times, looks at him too intensely, smiles in ways that suggest their connection is more than casual acquaintance." Margaret's voice grew soft, with remembered emotion. "I left after the third dance, ran to the parking lot like a coward." "You weren't a coward," Lancelot said firmly. "You were protecting what you had chosen to value most, your marriage, your commitment to the life you were building with Thomas." David was staring at the photograph as if it might reveal additional secrets. "Mom, did Dad know about any of this?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had wondered for 50 years if Thomas had suspected, if her behavior that night or in the days that followed had given her away. He had been quieter than usual when she returned home, had watched her with a thoughtfulness that might have been suspicion or might have been concern. "I don't know," she admitted. "I hope not. I tried so hard to be the wife he deserved, to put that night behind me and focus on our life together." "Did you succeed?" Emma asked gently. Margaret looked at Lancelot, seeing in his face the same question she had been carrying for decades. Had she truly put him behind her, or had some part of her heart remained in that hospital room, on that dance floor, in the space between what was and what might have been? "I loved your grandfather completely," she said finally. "I was faithful to him in every way that mattered. But did I forget Lancelot entirely? Did I stop wondering about the path not taken?" She shook her head slowly. "The pressed rose in my purse suggests otherwise." The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Margaret realized that speaking these truths aloud was somehow liberating. For 50 years, she had carried these secrets alone, had shouldered the weight of complicated emotions without anyone to share them with. Now, surrounded by her family and the man who had sparked those emotions, she felt lighter than she had in years. "What happens now?" Emma asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Emma's question hung in the air like a challenge, and Margaret felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her. What did happen now? What could happen when the past had suddenly become present, when secrets 50 years in the keeping had been exposed in the span of an afternoon? She opened her mouth to answer, but the words were lost as a sudden sharp pain shot through her chest. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her heart as the library tilted around her. The pressed rose scattered from her lap as she gripped the chair arm, struggling to breathe. "Margaret!" Lancelot was at her side instantly, his supernatural speed carrying him across the room before anyone else could move. His cool hand steadied her as another wave of pain crashed through her chest, this one so intense it left her vision blurring. "Mom!" David rushed forward, his earlier suspicions forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. "What's wrong? What's happening?" Margaret tried to speak but found she couldn't catch her breath. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not the sharp, sudden agony of a heart attack, but something deeper, more insidious. It felt like her body was betraying her from the inside, like some fundamental system was failing. "Call an ambulance," Patricia said, already reaching for her phone. "No," Margaret managed to gasp, though even that single word cost her enormous effort. "Not yet." Lancelot's hands remained on her shoulders, and she could feel something flowing from him into her, not healing exactly, but a kind of supernatural awareness that allowed her to understand what was happening to her body. The knowledge hit her like a second wave of pain, this one emotional rather than physical. Cancer, advanced, aggressive, already spread through her lymph nodes and into her organs. Her body's recent fatigue, the occasional shortness of breath she had attributed to age, the subtle changes in appetite and energy, they all made terrible sense now. "How long have you known?" Lancelot asked, softly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I didn't," Margaret whispered back. "Not until now. But that's why you came, isn't it? You sensed it." His nod was barely perceptible, but it confirmed what she had already understood. Lancelot's return wasn't about romance or unfinished business. It was about death. Her death. The pain receded enough for her to breathe more normally, but the knowledge remained, settling into her consciousness like a stone dropping into still water. She was dying, not someday, not in the vague future that elderly people contemplated with philosophical resignation, but soon. Very soon. "Margaret, what's happening?" How could she explain that she had just learned she was dying? How could she tell her granddaughter on her wedding day that the woman who had helped raise her, who had taught her to bake cookies and braid her hair and believe in true love, would soon be gone? "I think," Margaret said carefully, "we need to have a conversation with a doctor." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical consultations, X-rays, and blood tests that confirmed what Lancelot's supernatural senses had already revealed. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the emergency physician who examined Margaret at the local hospital, delivered the news with the kind of gentle professionalism that came from years of practice with difficult conversations. "The cancer is quite advanced, Doctor," Chen explained to the family gathered in the small consultation room. "Based on the imaging and preliminary blood work, I would estimate it's been developing for at least 6 months, possibly longer. You haven't experienced symptoms?" "Some fatigue," Margaret admitted. "Loss of appetite occasionally. I thought it was just aging." "Doctor." Chen's expression was sympathetic but honest. "That's common. This type of cancer often presents with vague symptoms that can be easily attributed to other causes. Unfortunately, by the time we catch it at this stage, treatment options are limited. Limited how? David demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. We could attempt chemotherapy, but given your mother's age and the extent of the disease, it would be more likely to diminish her quality of life than extend it significantly. Radiation might help with pain management, but it wouldn't be curative. The clinical language felt surreal. Margaret listened to them discuss her body, her life, her death, as if she weren't sitting right there. She felt Lancelot's presence in the hallway outside. He had not been allowed into the family consultation, but she could sense him waiting, could feel his supernatural awareness of her emotional state. How long? She asked simply. Dr. Chen hesitated. It's difficult to say with certainty. Without treatment, perhaps weeks to a few months. With palliative care to manage symptoms, possibly longer, but the focus would be on comfort rather than cure. Emma had been silent through most of the medical discussion, but now she spoke up. What would you choose, grandmother, if it were your decision to make? The question surprised everyone, including Margaret. She looked around at her family, at David, whose protective instincts were warring with the reality that there was nothing he could protect her from, at Patricia, whose practical nature was struggling with the impracticality of death, at Emma, whose wedding day had been transformed into something entirely different. I don't know, Margaret said honestly. Yesterday I was worrying about whether I should give up driving. Today I'm being asked to choose between a short, comfortable death and a slightly longer, miserable one. I need time to think. But even as she said it, Margaret realized that time was exactly what she didn't have. The cancer explained so much about the past few months, the increasing fatigue that had made social activities feel overwhelming, the subtle changes in her body that she had attributed to normal aging, the growing sense that she was somehow disconnected from the world around her. It also explained why Lancelot had come. Whatever supernatural senses he possessed had detected what her doctors had missed, had brought him back to her side, not to offer eternal life, but to help her face eternal rest. When they finally left the hospital, the sun was setting behind Blackthorn Manor, casting long shadows across the grounds where Emma's wedding reception had continued in their absence. James had explained the medical emergency to the guests, and most had departed with well wishes and promises to check in later. Margaret found Lancelot waiting in the manor's garden, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. He didn't speak as she approached, but his presence was comforting in ways that surprised her. You knew, she said. It wasn't a question. I sensed something was wrong. Death has a particular scent when it's approaching, not unpleasant, but distinctive. When I realized what I was sensing, he turned to face her, and in his ancient eyes she saw not pity, but understanding. I thought you might appreciate not facing it alone. Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time since receiving the diagnosis. I've never been afraid of dying, she said. Thomas and I talked about it often after his cancer diagnosis. We both agreed that death was just another part of life, something to be faced with dignity when the time came. But, Lancelot prompted gently, but I never imagined I would have to face it while feeling so invisible, so irrelevant to the world around me. I thought I would die as someone who mattered, not as someone people were already trying to move into assisted living. The bitter truth of it surprised her. She wasn't afraid of death, she was afraid of dying as the diminished version of herself she had become, rather than as the vibrant woman she had once been. That, Lancelot said softly, is something I can help you change. Margaret spent that night in her own bed, surrounded by the familiar comfort of the Victorian house that had been her home for 43 years. But sleep eluded her, and she found herself moving through the rooms like a ghost, touching objects that held memories of the life she was about to leave behind. In the morning, she sat at her kitchen table with a pad of ivory stationery and her favorite fountain pen, a gift from Thomas on their 25th wedding anniversary. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as she realized how much she needed to say and how little time she had to say it. Asterisk, my dearest David, Asterisk, she began the first letter. Asterisk, by the time you read this, you will understand why I made the choices I'm about to make. Please know that they come from love, love for you, for your family, and for the man I was blessed to call your father for 31 years. Asterisk. The letter to David was the hardest to write. She explained her decision to forego aggressive treatment, to choose quality of life over quantity of suffering. She wrote about her pride in the man he had become, about how his protective instincts came from the same love that had made Thomas such a devoted husband and father. But she also asked him to understand that protecting someone sometimes meant respecting their right to make their own choices, even when those choices were difficult to accept. Asterisk. Your mother was never a woman who needed to be saved. Asterisk, she wrote. Asterisk. She was a woman who needed to be trusted to know her own mind, even at the end. Asterisk. The letter to Patricia was shorter, but no less heartfelt. Margaret thanked her daughter-in-law for the years of care and concern, for the grandchildren she had helped raise, for the family dinners and holiday celebrations that had given structure and meaning to Margaret's widowed years. Sarah's letter was perhaps the most emotional. Her daughter lived in Seattle now, her own children grown and scattered across the country. They spoke every few weeks, but the conversations had become increasingly perfunctory, full of updates about health and weather rather than the deeper connections they had once shared. Asterisk, I want you to know. Asterisk, Margaret wrote to Sarah, asterisk, that watching you become the woman you are has been one of my life's greatest joys. You inherited your father's sense of justice and your mother's stubborn streak, and you've used both to make the world a little bit better. Don't let my death diminish your light. Asterisk. Michael's letter was different. He had always been her dreamer, her artist, the child who saw beauty in unexpected places. He would understand better than the others why she had chosen to spend her final weeks with someone who saw her not as she had become, but as she had always been. Asterisk. Remember, asterisk, she wrote to him, asterisk, that love comes in many forms and the heart doesn't stop recognizing beauty just because the body grows old. Don't mourn the choices I'm making. Celebrate that I was brave enough to make them. Asterisk. But it was Emma's letter that proved most challenging. How could she explain to a young woman just beginning her married life that sometimes the greatest act of love was knowing when to let go? Asterisk. My darling Emma. Asterisk, she began. Asterisk. Your wedding day gave me the most precious gift, the chance to see you begin the same journey I took with your grandfather. Marriage is not always easy. But if you choose each day to see your husband clearly, to love him not for who you hope he'll become, but for who he is right now, you will build something beautiful together. Asterisk. She wrote about the pressed rose, about choices made and paths not taken, about the complexity of a heart large enough to love completely while still carrying space for wonder about what might have been. Asterisk. I am not leaving you to chase a ghost from my past. Asterisk, she wrote. Asterisk. I am choosing to spend my final days with someone who reminds me that I have lived a life worth celebrating, that I have been loved not just by your grandfather, but by the broader universe that sent me exactly the companions I needed when I needed them most. Asterisk. By the time Margaret finished the letters, the sun was high and Lancelot had arrived. She found him in the garden behind her house, sitting on the stone bench where Thomas used to read the morning paper. He looked up as she approached, and she saw in his expression the same careful respect he had shown 50 years ago. You've made your decision, he said. It wasn't a question. I've made several decisions, Margaret replied, settling beside him on the bench. The first is that I won't be pursuing aggressive treatment, Doctor. Chen was right at my age. With the cancer this advanced, chemotherapy would steal whatever good time I have left without offering any real hope of cure. Lancelot nodded. That's a wise choice. What others have you made? Margaret handed him the stack of sealed letters. I want you to deliver these to my family afterward. They explain my choices, my reasons. They'll understand eventually, but they need time to process. And your other decisions? Margaret felt her cheeks warm despite herself. I want to spend whatever time I have left learning things I never had the chance to learn, seeing things I never had the courage to see. I want to remember what it feels like to matter to someone, to be seen as more than just an elderly woman counting down her final days. And you trust me to help you with that? The question was loaded with implications that made Margaret's pulse quicken. I trusted you 50 years ago when you offered me immortality. I trust you now when you're offering me something even more precious, the chance to die as the woman I've always been, rather than the diminished version everyone expects me to be. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the late morning light filter through the old oak tree that dominated Margaret's backyard. Finally, Lancelot spoke. There are things you should know about what I'm offering, what I can and cannot do. Tell me. I cannot extend your life significantly. The cancer has progressed too far for even supernatural intervention to reverse. But I can ease your passage, can remove the fear and pain that often accompany dying. I can share with you experiences that mortal humans rarely have the opportunity to witness. Margaret felt her heart rate increase. What kind of experiences? I could show you the world as I see it, colors beyond the normal spectrum, sounds that human ears cannot usually detect, the energy that flows between all living things. I could share memories from my centuries of existence, let you experience history not as something read about in books, but as lived reality. The offer was staggering. Margaret tried to imagine experiencing the world through 800-year-old eyes, seeing colors that had no names, feeling the connections between all living things. And in return, she asked. No return required. Your kindness 50 years ago was payment enough for whatever I can offer now. This is simply a gift, a way of honoring what you gave me when I needed it most. Margaret thought about the family members who would soon discover her letters, who would struggle to understand her choices. She thought about David's protective instincts and Patricia's practical concerns, about Emma's romantic nature and her own desire to end her life on her own terms. They'll think I've lost my mind, she said. They'll think you've found your courage, Lancelot corrected. There's a difference. That afternoon, Margaret called a family meeting. David and Patricia arrived first, followed by Emma and James, who had delayed their honeymoon to deal with the medical crisis. Michael drove down from Portland, his artist sensitivity allowing him to read the emotional undercurrents that others might miss. Margaret served tea in the good china and waited until everyone was settled in the living room before beginning. I've decided to forego treatment, she announced without preamble. Dr. Chen has explained the options, and I've chosen to focus on comfort and quality of life rather than fighting a battle I cannot win. The protests came immediately and from all directions. David demanded second opinions. Patricia suggested clinical trials. Emma talked about experimental treatments they could research. Only Michael remained quiet, watching his mother with the kind of careful attention that suggested he understood there was more to her announcement. I've also decided, Margaret continued when the initial objections subsided, to spend my remaining time in a way that honors the life I've lived rather than mourning the life I'm losing. What does that mean? David asked suspiciously. Margaret looked around the room at the faces of people she loved, people who loved her but had gradually stopped seeing her as anything more than their aging mother and grandmother. It means I'm going to live fully for whatever time I have left. It means I'm going to rediscover the woman I was before I became invisible. And it means I'm going to do it with Lancelot's help. The silence that followed her announcement was deafening. Margaret could see her family processing her words, could feel their confusion and growing concern. Mom, David said carefully, I think the diagnosis might be affecting your judgment. This stranger is not a stranger, Margaret interrupted firmly. And my judgment is perfectly clear, perhaps clearer than it's been in years." She stood and moved to the mantelpiece, where a photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day had held place of honor for 7 years. Beside it, she placed the pressed rose from her purse. 50 years ago," she said, "I made a choice to live a conventional life with a wonderful man. That choice brought me all of you, and I regret nothing about it. But now, at the end of my life, I'm making a different choice. I'm choosing to remember who I was before I became someone who needed to be protected from her own decisions." Emma was the first to speak. "What can we do to support you, grandmother?" The question surprised everyone, including Margaret. She looked at her granddaughter, so young, so newly married, so willing to believe in possibilities that others might dismiss. "Trust me," Margaret said simply. "Trust that I know what I'm doing, even if it doesn't make sense to you yet." 3 days later, Margaret's family gathered once more in the great hall of Blackthorn Manor, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different from Emma's wedding celebration. James had graciously offered the space when Margaret expressed her wish to say goodbye in a setting that felt meaningful rather than clinical. The Gothic arches that had once seemed oppressive now felt protective, creating an intimate sanctuary away from the outside world. Margaret had spent those 3 days with Lancelot, and the transformation was visible to everyone who looked at her. Gone was the invisible elderly woman who had sat alone at the wedding reception. In her place was someone who seemed to glow with an inner light, whose silver hair caught the afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows, whose eyes held depths that spoke of recent wonders. Lancelot stood near the great fireplace, his presence no longer causing the uncomfortable chill that had marked their first encounter. Instead, the air around him seemed to shimmer with warmth and possibility. In his hands, he held a crystal vial filled with what appeared to be liquid starlight, a substance that pulsed with its own ethereal luminescence. "The essence contained here," Lancelot explained to the assembled family, his voice carrying the formal cadence they had come to recognize, "is not a cure, nor is it intended to grant immortality. It is something far more precious. It is peace distilled into its purest form." David, who had spent the past 3 days researching everything from experimental cancer treatments to legal guardianship proceedings, looked skeptical. "What exactly does that mean?" Margaret stepped forward, moving with a grace that seemed impossible given her diagnosis. The cancer was progressing rapidly now, but instead of diminishing her, it seemed to have liberated something essential in her spirit. "It means," she said, her voice clear and strong, "that I will leave this world without fear, without pain, and most importantly, without regret. It means that my final moments will be filled with beauty rather than suffering." Emma, resplendent in a simple blue dress that reminded everyone of the sapphire gown in the old photograph, moved to her grandmother's side. "Tell us what you've experienced these past few days, grandmother. Help us understand." Margaret's face lit up with wonder. "I've seen colors that have no names, heard music that exists between the notes humans normally perceive. I've felt the connections that bind all living things together, golden threads of energy that weave through everything from the smallest flower to the mightiest oak tree." She paused, looking at each family member in turn. "But more than that, I've remembered who I am beneath all the layers of age and invisibility. I've remembered the woman who was brave enough to sit with a wounded stranger, who was strong enough to choose her own path, even when offered impossible alternatives." Patricia, who had been unusually quiet since Margaret's announcement, finally spoke. "Margaret, we just want to understand. Are you choosing this because you're afraid of how the cancer will progress?" "I'm choosing this because I'm no longer afraid of anything," Margaret replied. "For too long, I've been afraid of being a burden, afraid of losing my independence, afraid of becoming irrelevant. Those fears have been making me smaller, dimmer, less than who I truly am." Michael, who had been sketching quietly in a corner, looked up from his pad. "Mom, you're glowing. I mean that literally. There's light coming from you that I've never seen before." It was true. Margaret's skin seemed to emit a soft radiance that complemented the crystal vial's luminescence. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, as if she were being lit from within by some supernatural source. "That," Lancelot said softly, "is what happens when someone stops fighting who they are and embraces their true nature. Your grandmother has spent 76 years being magnificent, but only in the past few days has she allowed herself to feel magnificent." Margaret moved to the center of the great hall, where a single chair had been placed. It was an ornate piece, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the changing light. As she settled into it, the chair seemed to embrace her, supporting her frail body while somehow emphasizing her inherent dignity. "I want each of you to know," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stone chamber, "that choosing this path doesn't diminish the love I have for any of you. If anything, it amplifies it. By leaving this world on my own terms, I'm giving you the gift of a death that celebrates life, rather than one that surrenders to suffering." David's composure finally cracked. "Mom, I don't know how to let you go." "You don't have to let me go," Margaret replied gently. "You have to let me choose. There's a difference." Lancelot approached Margaret's chair, the crystal vial glowing brighter in his hands. "Are you ready?" Margaret nodded, then looked around at her family one final time. "I love you all. Remember me not as the diminished woman I was becoming, but as the vibrant person I've always been underneath. Remember that courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose how our story ends." She reached for the crystal vial, her fingers closing around its smooth surface. The moment she touched it, the entire hall filled with golden light, warm and comforting as a summer afternoon. The light seemed to flow from the vial into Margaret, and as it did, years of pain and worry visibly melted away from her features. For the first time in decades, Margaret looked truly, completely at peace. As Margaret held the crystal vial, the golden light that filled the great hall began to take on a more complex pattern, weaving itself into visible threads that connected her to each person in the room. The threads pulsed gently, like luminous heartbeats, and everyone present could feel the warmth of those connections settling into their souls. Emma gasped as she watched one of the golden threads extend from Margaret's heart to her own. Through that connection, she could suddenly feel everything her grandmother had experienced over the past 76 years. The joy of her wedding day to Thomas, the overwhelming love she had felt at the birth of each child, the quiet satisfaction of thousands of small acts of kindness and devotion. "Can you feel that?" Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can feel everything," David said, his voice filled with wonder. "Mom, I can feel how much you love us, how much you've always loved us, even when we stopped really seeing you." Margaret smiled, and in that expression everyone could see glimpses of every age she had ever been: the young woman who had danced with Lancelot at the charity gala, the new bride radiating happiness, the devoted mother reading bedtime stories, the widow learning to live alone with grace. The golden thread connecting Margaret to Lancelot was the brightest of all, pulsing with 8 centuries of accumulated wisdom and compassion. Through their connection, Margaret's consciousness began to expand beyond the confines of her aging body, allowing her to experience memories that weren't her own. She saw the world through Lancelot's ancient eyes, witnessed the construction of cathedrals that would stand for millennia, watched empires rise and fall, felt the weight of centuries of loneliness, broken only by brief moments of connection with mortal souls. But more than that, she felt his profound gratitude for the 3 nights she had spent in that hospital room 50 years ago, watching over him with simple human kindness. "You saved me," she said to him, her voice soft with understanding. "Not just that night in the hospital, but now. You've saved me from dying as someone I'm not." "We saved each other," Lancelot replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "Your choice to remain mortal taught me that the beauty of life isn't in its length, but in its depth. Your courage to live fully, to love completely, showed me what it means to be truly alive. As the golden light intensified, Margaret felt her consciousness beginning to separate gently from her physical body. There was no pain in the process, only a gradual sense of liberation, like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. She could feel the cancer that had been consuming her body, but it no longer held any power over her. It was simply another part of the human experience she was completing. Through the supernatural connection, her family could sense what was happening. Instead of the agonizing grief they had expected, they felt only profound peace and overwhelming love. Margaret's transition wasn't a loss, it was a transformation into something larger and more beautiful. "I can see everything," Margaret said, her voice taking on an ethereal quality. "The choices I made, the paths I didn't take, they're all part of the same beautiful tapestry. There are no mistakes, only different ways of learning how to love." Patricia found her voice, though it was shaky with emotion. "Margaret, what do you want us to remember about you?" Margaret's consciousness, now expanded beyond the normal boundaries of human perception, seemed to consider the question from multiple dimensions simultaneously. Remember that love multiplies rather than diminishes when it's shared. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the choice to act in spite of fear. And remember that every person, regardless of age or circumstance, carries infinite worth within themselves. She looked at David with eyes that seemed to hold starlight. "Stop trying to protect everyone from life, my dear son. Trust the people you love to make their own choices, even when those choices frighten you." To Patricia, "Thank you for sharing your family with me, for making room in your heart for a difficult mother-in-law, for raising grandchildren who will carry forward everything good about our family." To Michael, "Keep seeing beauty in unexpected places. The world needs artists who remind us that wonder exists in the spaces between what is and what could be." And finally, to Emma, "Love James with your whole heart, but never lose yourself in that love. Be the woman you're meant to be, not just the woman you think he wants you to be. That's the secret to a marriage that transcends ordinary happiness." The golden threads connecting Margaret to her family began to pulse in harmony with her heartbeat, which was slowing to a peaceful rhythm. Her physical body, still seated in the ornate chair, looked serene and somehow ageless in the supernatural light. "I'm not leaving you," she said softly. "I'm simply changing the way I exist in your lives. Love this strong doesn't end with physical death. It transforms into something eternal." As Margaret's consciousness expanded further, she became aware of Thomas's presence waiting for her, along with her parents, old friends, and countless others who had crossed over before her. But she also felt her eternal connection to Lancelot, who would carry the memory of their love across whatever centuries lay ahead. The great hall filled with such radiant warmth that even the ancient stones seemed to glow with inner light. 1 month later, the autumn light filtered through the windows of Margaret's Victorian house, casting warm patterns across the hardwood floors she had polished countless times over 4 decades. The house was no longer empty. David and Patricia had moved in temporarily to sort through Margaret's belongings, but more importantly, to process the profound change that her death had brought to their understanding of life itself. Emma sat in Margaret's rocking chair, the same chair where her grandmother had spent countless hours reading stories, mending clothes, and watching the seasons change through the front window. The chair moved gently despite the absence of any breeze, rocking with the same rhythm Margaret had favoured during her quiet evening hours. "She's here," Emma said softly to James, who was arranging flowers in Margaret's favourite crystal vase. "I can feel her presence every time I sit in this chair." James paused in his flower arranging, no longer sceptical of claims that would have seemed impossible a month ago. Witnessing Margaret's transformation and peaceful transition had changed everyone who had been present, had opened them to possibilities that existed beyond the rational world they thought they understood. "The whole house feels different," he agreed, "warmer somehow, more alive." David emerged from Margaret's bedroom carrying a stack of photo albums. His protective instincts had been redirected since his mother's death, channeled now into preserving her memory and advocating for others facing end-of-life decisions. He had begun volunteering with a hospice organization, using his legal background to help elderly people navigate advanced directives and maintain their autonomy in medical decisions. "Look what I found," he said, settling onto the sofa with the albums. She kept photographs of everything, not just family events, but random moments. Here's one of her feeding squirrels in the backyard. Here's another of her reading to children at the library's story hour. Patricia joined him, studying the images with new eyes. She documented her whole life, she marveled. All these moments we thought were ordinary, but she treated them like treasures. The discovery had been part of a month-long process of re-evaluation. Margaret's peaceful death had forced her family to confront how they had been diminishing her in the final years of her life, how their well-meaning concern had gradually reduced a vibrant woman to a collection of problems to be solved. Michael arrived that afternoon with a canvas under his arm, his latest attempt to capture what he had witnessed in Blackthorn Manor's Great Hall. He had been painting obsessively since Margaret's death, trying to recreate the golden light that had surrounded her, the sense of transcendence that had transformed their understanding of death itself. "I can never quite get it right," he said, propping the painting against the mantelpiece. "The light was unlike anything I've ever seen, and every time I try to paint it, it feels insufficient." Emma stood to study the painting, still gently rocking Margaret's chair with one foot. "Maybe it's not meant to be captured exactly," she suggested. "Maybe the memory of it is more important than any representation could be." The painting showed a figure surrounded by swirls of golden light. But Emma was right. The actual experience had been beyond anything that could be fully reproduced. It had been about feeling rather than seeing, about understanding rather than witnessing. As afternoon faded into evening, Lancelot appeared in the garden, just as he had every day since Margaret's death. He moved like a guardian shadow, maintaining his vigil without intruding on the family's grief process. Today, however, Emma invited him inside for the first time since the memorial service. "Thank you," David said simply, as Lancelot settled into Thomas's old armchair, "for giving her what we couldn't." "What you couldn't?" Lancelot looked puzzled. "The chance to be seen as she truly was," Patricia explained. "We were so focused on keeping her safe that we forgot to let her feel valued." Lancelot was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother was remarkable long before I returned to her life," he said finally. "What I offered wasn't transformation, it was simply recognition of what had always been true." Emma's hand moved unconsciously to her still flat belly, where new life was just beginning to grow. She had discovered her pregnancy the previous week, and somehow she knew the timing wasn't coincidental. Life continuing in the wake of death. Love creating new possibilities, even in the midst of grief. "We're thinking of naming the baby Margaret," she said. "If it's a girl." The announcement brought tears to several eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Margaret's influence would continue, would ripple forward through generations who would grow up hearing stories of their brave great-grandmother who had chosen to die as she had lived on her own terms. As darkness settled over the house, Lancelot stood to leave. But before going, he moved to the window where Margaret had spent so many hours watching the world beyond her garden. From his pocket, he withdrew a single red rose, fresh, perfect, and somehow luminous in the lamplight. He placed it on the windowsill, exactly where Margaret used to set her morning coffee cup. "Some love transcends mortality," he said softly. "Some connections endure beyond the boundaries of life and death. What your grandmother and I shared will continue for as long as I exist, and what she shared with all of you will continue for as long as love itself endures." The rose on the windowsill seemed to pulse with gentle light, and for a moment everyone in the room could swear they felt Margaret's presence more strongly than ever, not as a ghost haunting the spaces she had left behind, but as a continuing force of love and wisdom that would guide her family forward. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the oak tree in Margaret's backyard, and the rocking chair moved gently in rhythm with its whispered song. Inside, her family began to understand that death, when faced with courage and dignity, wasn't an ending at all. It was simply another way of loving across time. In the months and years that followed, they would carry Margaret's example forward. David advocating for elderly dignity, Patricia volunteering with grief counseling, Michael creating art that celebrated the connections between all living things, and Emma raising her daughter to believe that love, true love, recognizes no boundaries and acknowledges no limitations. Margaret's story had ended, but her legacy was just beginning.